Hello, everyone. This interview I know is old. It looks like it's over a year old, but I've been seeing clips of it, and it was just annoying me so much that I decided that I would make a video response to parts of it. It's too long. I'm not going to cover the whole thing. This is Jordan Peterson interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu about a year ago on his show, and Israel's in the news all the time. Netanyahu's in the news all the time. uh, Zionist slash Jewish influence in the U.S. media and certain sectors of it have seemed to be splitting, bifurcating at this time in an interesting, maybe even unprecedented way. And I don't necessarily want to go into all that. This is also going to be a little test to see if this kind of format is allowed. I have a feeling this could get taken down. I've had videos taken down in the past, not from Daily Wire. It was way before Daily Wire existed, and it's always if I do anything about Jews. Um, Specifically, I made a video just saying that Holocaust denial shouldn't be a crime. I wasn't denying the Holocaust. I don't deny the Holocaust, but it shouldn't be a crime if you do, however that's defined. And that video got taken down. So yeah, we're going to jump through this, watch parts of this, and I'm going to respond as we go.
To give credence and sympathy, say, to the Palestinian viewpoint. And I'd like to rectify my ignorance and maybe help my viewers and listeners do the same thing. So would it be useful to start with Herzl?
Well, I'd start, Herzl was what I call our modern Moses, but I'd actually start with the original Moses.
Yeah, you're right there. So we have basically a conflation of Zionism with Judaism. Now, obviously, they are very related. There are, of course, Zionists who are not Jewish. There's a lot of Christian Zionists. There are a lot of political Zionists. But I think we're right there. So if you're going to justify anything that's happening today based off of Herzl, that's one thing. We know Herzl's real. He really existed. He had writings. You could take him or leave him. There's things about Herzl that I like. There's things about Herzl that I don't like. There's a lot of things about political Zionism that make sense. There's things that, I mean, Zionism is itself a rich ideological tradition, and they don't all agree with each other. And there's certain parts of it that I'm fine with. You know, I'm engaged in a little libertarian Zionism here in the Free State Project. So like, there's versions of it that I don't have a problem with. But Moses is a mythological figure. We don't know that Moses is real. There's no archaeological evidence that he is real. There is no contemporary historical evidence and inscriptions or writings, which we had literate societies in Egypt, in the Levant, in the Mesopotamia at that time. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't exist. Our records from that period are obviously very sketchy, but there is literally no evidence that he actually existed. And so if you want to use it as a story and you like the story and you want to tell yourself maybe he existed and maybe he did, the only crumb in the story that I think is interesting is that Moses is actually an Egyptian name. So there's a little bit of an embarrassment here that you have the Hebrews, the Israelites, their, you know, liberator, so to speak, sounds like he's got an Egyptian name. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's true or not, but this is such a poor basis for anything that's happening. Let's, for instance, right now in Gaza or in 1948 or basically at any point since then. Um, it's not historical. It's mythological.
The Jewish people have lived in the land of Israel, what is now the state of Israel, have lived here and have been attached to this place for about 3,500 years.
So, of course, in the story, I mean, and it is just a story. The Moses is leading the Jews from Egypt. We know historically, even before this period, that there was a lot of interaction between Egypt and the Levant. Egypt in the New Kingdom and probably also in the Second Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, controlled to one degree or another a lot of the Levant, and we had a lot of what the Egyptians would often call Asiatics, who would be involved in Egypt, and there was even a dynasty in Egypt called the Hyksos that are Asiatics, whose expulsion led to the New Kingdom, so-called. But like this 3,000, we don't have anything that pins them there. And also the story of Abraham, as far as the story is from I think Ur, which is in southern Iraq. So, but in the story, the Hebrews, the Israelites are immigrants, they're conquerors, they're colonists. Granted, in the story, divinely inspired ones, they're doing what God says, but they're not originally from there. To the extent that, how can anyone, I mean, the problem with this kind of logic is that you can draw an ancestral line. Everyone can draw all of them back to Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, or if you're more religious, to Adam and Eve, in which case we all have a common ancestor. It's similar to where in South Africa, some of the black nationalists there will say stuff like the Boers, they have a history here, but we have a history that goes back 100,000 years. Well, 100,000 years ago, everyone, I mean, as far as we can tell, this may change, but like it seems like everyone traces their ancestry to Africa 100,000 years ago, whether they lived in Eurasia or Native Americans or Austronesians. At that time scale, doesn't it's all intertwined and intermixed, and so far in the past as to be like legally and ethically totally irrelevant. Um, Now, what is unique about um, this Jewish narrative is that it's in the Bible. It's in so everyone, the three main religions all take um, the first five books, the Pentateuch, very seriously. Christians take it super seriously. Jews take it super seriously. Muslims take it a little bit less seriously. But it's still a story, and even within the story, and this is what's funny, is where he's going to be mixing and matching. Sometimes he's making an analogy, sometimes he's making a logical argument, sometimes he's making a historical claim, sometimes he's making a religious claim, and he's kind of mixing and matching it as he goes, and it's incredibly sloppy.
3.5 millennia. Now, for the first 2 millennia, roughly, of that time, we were living in what is described in a text commonly known as the Bible. So the Bible describes how the Jewish people lived on this land, were attached to this land, fought off conquerors, sometimes were conquered, but still.
Yeah, it also describes magic and gods and, talking bushes and, just things that are just lots of stuff that has no historical relevance. I was reading recently that the earliest datable character in the Bible where they find any historical reference is Omri, which was a Hebrew king, which is we're going back to the 7th or 8th century BC. So that is old. That's going back a long way for sure, but not 3,200, 4,000 years. There's also this idea that, and it's common. People like to do this. Not just the Jews do this. People like to say their cultural group has this great antiquity. The Jewish calendar is 5,000 years old. The Chinese will do this. The Egyptians obviously will do this. But again, it's not very legal or ethical. The other thing is everyone who's alive today can, even if we don't have the history for everyone, obviously you exist. Your language group existed. So like we don't have the earliest attested Indo-European language, for instance, is Hittite, which I think is older than the earliest attested Semitic language, which is Eblanite. I could be getting that slightly off. They're very similar, but we know that there were antecedents to both. We know that before Hittite there was Proto-Hittite, and all the other the Proto-Indo-European language, Pi, was a language, and we know it exists, and we actually know quite a lot about it, even though it's not like literally attested, because nobody who spoke it was literate. But like, there's no point where you can go back and say, well, there's a Jewish identity that exists, and nothing else existed. Like everyone else, maybe not was attested, but it's there. We know it has to be there because you're here. The language is here. The culture's there. It followed through. The other thing to say is that these things change so much. So like he's talking about a period that would be first and second temple, and so many of the things that we associate with Judaism now, when we can go back far enough, for instance, there's evidence that they didn't always do circumcision, the kosher thing, the dress stuff, the whole rabbinic authority that everyone associates Jews with synagogues and rabbis. That's not something that goes back that far, And there's the Hebrews, and then there's the Israelites. There's the way that they talk about the deity. Some of it is a heliocentric deity where it looks like there's other gods and Elohim is one of them, and others where there's only one and there's angels, and so you can trace it back, but it's so different that it's kind of silly to come in. And sometimes Native Americans will do this too, where they'll find a skeleton that's 9,000 years old, and the Hopi will come and say, that's one of our ancestors. Not to pick on the Hopi, but like, and it even may be true that that is an ancestral person. Not to get into the debate about the legal status of those remains, but to call that pre-existing antecedent society Hopi is just a little silly. You know, if we find Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal DNA or individuals, and then say, oh, those are Englishmen. You know, even if we could prove, and even if it was true that they were indeed ancestors of Englishmen or Germans or whatever, it it's there's so much obliteration of the actual cultural continuity there that it's false to even assert that. And the other thing, it doesn't matter if there was cultural, like it wouldn't matter if Judaism that he's talking about 3,200 years ago, that we have no evidence existed at that time. Let's say it did exist and it was identical to Judaism today. It would have no ethical relevance to what's happening right now, or what happened in 1948, or at any point since then.
Stayed on their land. And that continued for a very long time until roughly the 6th, 7th century, actually, after the birth of Christ. Okay? For roughly for 2,000.
I wonder if he has to like hold his nose when he says the birth of Christ, because it's not the Messiah as far as he's concerned, probably, unless he's secretly a Christian.
1,000 years. We were conquered by the Romans. We were conquered by the Byzantines. They did a lot of bad things to us.
And the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and everybody. So, yeah, nothing new there. This whole stuff about the expulsion, though, we do know about the expulsion. I mean, we don't know, but like the Bible attests the expulsion to Babylon, and that's where parts of the Bible were written during that or after that, or at least referenced back to that period. The Roman expulsion, I think, is way less attested. We're not really sure. That wasn't really something that the Romans were big onto doing. The Assyrians used to do that a lot. The Soviets did that a lot, but I don't know that the Romans did, and there really isn't a lot of attestation for this. There's this kind of assumption that if we find Jews later in history, and there weren't a lot of Jews in the Holy Land, therefore they must have moved. And it ignores the fact, and this is, right now we don't think of Judaism as an evangelical religion, but it has had periods where it has been evangelical, where it has spread. That doesn't, so many of you probably heard there's this big controversy of this kingdom called the Khazars, and our evidence for this is light. We know that it seems that the rulers of the Khazar kingdom did convert to Judaism. Whether or not all their subjects did or not is hotly and readily debatable question. But the point is that there was conversions that did happen, and so it's hypothetically possible that the people who call themselves Jews today in certain areas, or maybe many areas, are not literal descendants from the Jews of the Bible. They're descended from converted people. And even if that's not true, and I don't know that we'll ever know the history of that perfectly, and it's not super relevant, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, I'm not descended from Jews. I have no claim to be. I have no evidence that I am. But let's say that I convert to Judaism, which is allowed under Judaism. It is something that can be done. If I do that, does that mean I now have a 100% the same legitimacy as all these other people? Like, I can invoke this 3,000 years, all this occupation, all this history, all these stories, that I can just claim it for myself if I get recircumcised. And go through other dance that all Jews agree that I can do. Do I get to then claim that also, just by snapping my fingers and doing it? And I know it's more than a snap of your fingers, and I think the answer to that question is yes. I mean, I think there are Jews who are going to, you may be looking and say you're not a real Jew. That's definitely a kind of bigotry that certainly exists, but in general, it's allowed, and also it's always been allowed, and so this has been going on through history. We could debate exactly where and how often, but to assume that it can't happen, and that the only explanation for Jews showing up in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Russia in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, or in Western Europe, is because of the Roman expulsion in 150 or 700 or whatever. I mean, he's talking about 700. He's talking about after the Byzantines are gone. This is now in the Arab period. It's interesting too that it's been conquered by everybody, but the ones who are really the bad guys are the Arabs, not anyone else. He just says the Romans did bad stuff to it. The Romans did bad stuff to everyone. They're pretty fair in their tyranny.
But they didn't really exile us, contrary to what people think, okay?
Evidence for any of this?
The loss of our land actually occurred when the Arab conquest took place in the 7th century. The Arabs burst out from Arabia, and they did something that no other conqueror, not the Romans, not the Byzantines, not the Greeks before.
They converted them to Islam, most likely, through their tax system. And the Christians probably did that too.
For them, not Alexander the Great. Nobody did before. They actually started taking over the land of the Jewish farmer.
The Romans didn't take over the land. The Byzantines didn't take over the land. The Assyrians didn't take over the land. They all took over the land. Now maybe they didn't colonize it with Assyrian ethnics or Roman ethnics, although plenty of Romans did move there. But this is kind of, I think he's trying to distinguish the Arabs from everybody else, and obviously they aren't the same as everybody else, but in terms of like an ethical argument to like their occupation was somehow worse or cause an unnatural discontinuity relative to the others, I think is just kind of silly.
They brought in military colonies that took over the land.
Yeah, the Romans totally did that. The Byzantines totally did that. The Assyrians totally did that. The Egyptians totally did that. When you're conquering armies, build military colonies. It's kind of how they do it.
And gradually over the next 2 centuries, the Jews became a minority in our land.
Because they converted to Islam. And they didn't leave. And their descendants are still there.
So it is under the Arab conquest that the Jews lost their homeland. The Arabs were the
homeland that the book says that they stole, right? So again, it's not their original homeland, even according to the book that we're going to invoke. They were colonists. You can say from Egypt. You can say, well, they were in exile in Egypt. They originally were from there, but then Abraham is from Ur, which is in Iraq.
The Jews were the natives dispossessed. Well, that happens in history. The Jews were dispossessed. We were flung to the far corners of the earth, suffered unimaginable.
Well, really into the former places of the Khazar kingdom, but so not everywhere all over the world, but certain places, yeah.
Imaginable suffering because we have.
And again, we don't know. They could have converted. Like Judaism can convert people; it's allowed, and it can be an evangelical religion. Now they haven't been anywhere near as evangelical as Christians and Muslims have been, and you could just look at their populations to see that. But it has had periods where it has been, and we have records of it happening. So that's potentially part of the answer here.
But we didn't disappear, and we never gave up the dream of coming back to our ancestral homeland.
Maybe some of them didn't, but if that was their dream, many of them had thousands of years to do it and didn't do it. So I'm wondering how much of a dream it was. The Ottomans, some of these other ruling states, whether it was the Mamluks or the Crusader kingdoms when they were there, and then certainly the Ottomans had it for quite a big chunk of time. They weren't stopping Jews from going there. In fact, the Ottomans in particular were happy to welcome Jews coming from, say, Spain or places where they were getting persecuted in Christendom, which was a big problem in the mid second millennium, in the 1500s. So not many of them wanted to go, apparently. This is because there was nothing like legally stopping them.
So generation after generation, the Jews could be in Warsaw, they could be in Yemen, they could be in China, and they said next year in Jerusalem we'll come back.
How many of them said that, and over what period? This is something that this is a Zionist saying from the 19th century. Maybe it goes back earlier than that. I'm not sure, but to think all Jews through all history have been murmuring this in their prayers or whatever, I don't see any evidence. But even if it was true, again, it wouldn't matter. I mean, if I start praying every day that I don't know, that I want to that the Taj Mahal should belong to me, and and then my children do it, and at some point they can come and say, well, yeah, well, I guess I would have to write a fictional book saying that it was given to me, but whatever. Like,
in Jerusalem. Well, that was made possible because the Arabs who had conquered the land basically left it barren. They
yeah, so this is he will openly contradict himself repeatedly that yes, we expelled them and blah blah blah, but they weren't even there. And this is the hoax that it was empty. Of course, Jerusalem was occupied the whole time. There are other cities that were occupied the whole time. Now, was it? Could you go and find places in Palestine that were empty? Of course, you can go to places in Israel now. You can go to the Negev Desert in Israel now and look around like there's nobody here. This land is empty. You know, you can go to parts of the United States right now and look around and see nobody and be like, this is empty. This isn't a country. Um, yes, there were empty spots of Palestine. The population was lower. The population was lower everywhere. Yes, they didn't have skyscrapers or telecom companies in the 1880s or 1890s when Mark Twain went there. That doesn't mean it was empty. And you have to just not know about, I mean, we have records. The Ottoman Empire was occupying it. They're having wars. There was like, and so there's this Zionist trope, you know, oh, it's a people without a land and a land without the people. Well, it sounds great. It's not really true, literally. I mean, um, and it doesn't explain why has there been all this horrible violence. Who are you fighting?
never made it their own. It was a barren.
What do you mean they never made it their own? They lived there for, even by his story, uh, for, according to him, 1,400 years. You know, I don't know. That's many, many lifetimes. What do you have to do? I mean, I don't understand what is necessary to make it. They built the Dome of the Rock. It's still there. It's annoying everybody that it's there.
Land. It really had practically it was an empty land.
Practically, but actually not literally. It was. I'm just going to say that to make it sound more justified. What's going to happen?
And in the 19th century, the idea of coming back next year in Jerusalem became a reality. By the way, in part because of Christian Zionist support for the idea of the Great Return.
I actually agree with that. He's right about that. Also for political movements. I mean, the whole thing with like the Balfour Declaration. We don't have a really super strong, satisfactory answer. I've heard different ones, but it was clear that in the throes of World War I, the British government would do or say anything to help in the war effort. It was a very close-fought war, and there was a belief that that would be popular among Jews, and there were a lot of Jews in the United States, and so this would gain popularity among them in the United States. It was also thought that this would be popular among the Bolsheviks that were at the time coming to power in Russia. And there was this totally mistaken belief that Marxists in Russia who were about to, in the process of taking over Russia and forming the Soviet Union, are all secretly Zionists and would then, you know, really support this. What they missed is that basically radical Jews kind of picked. They either became Zionists or they became Marxists, and never the twain shall meet. They hated each other. The Jews who became Marxists in the Soviet Union had basically zero interest in Zionism ever. It probably did get some support in the United States, but there was already a long-going campaign. There were a lot of Anglophiles in the United States who weren't Jewish. J.P. Morgan had a super huge financial interest. But like, this seems to be, but it's just double dealing because they also told the Arabs, if you help us fight the Turks, the Ottomans, you know, we'll support your statehood, and they did to a limited extent. You know, they set up their protectorates and whatnot, and these fake Hashemite rulers in the House of Saud. That's all that stuff. You know, the king of Jordan, the former king of Iraq, the House of Saud. All of that stuff was set up kind of because of that war. Not that it itself didn't have antecedents, but yeah, there was people who supported other than Jews. There are also a lot of Jews who didn't support Zionism and still don't support Zionism. A lot of them mostly because they're just apathetic about it. They don't really care. They're doing their own thing, or because they actually have objections to it, whether they be religious or secular.
The Jews came back in the 19th century to the land of Israel. The result of this return was that we started building farms, factories, places of employment. Arabs from nearby countries started immigrating, and
Yeah, I mean, it's great when you start the clock after the Industrial Revolution and science has been invented, and then you say, "Hey, look, they were all feudal and medieval. They didn't have any technology." Yeah, well, the Jews, in the 1880s, the Jews lived in the Pale of Settlement, and they weren't any more sophisticated than anybody else for the most part. And yeah, they brought all this European technology and this European know-how and these European ideas. The first Zionists were, a lot of them were labor Zionists. They were super left-wing. They had all these Marxian ideas, and all this stuff from Europe, all this stuff that's from Europe, the people from Europe, ideas from Europe, languages from Europe. Because let's not forget, they're not speaking Hebrew. They're speaking Yiddish primarily, and German and other languages as well. Um, and that's what's distinguishing them from who was there before, not this very tenuous link to the antiquated past.
they called themselves Palestinians. They reconstructed history and said, we've been here for centuries. No, they haven't.
I mean, his story was that they've been there for centuries. His story is that they've been there since the 600s or 700s Common Era, which is still, at this point, 13 or 1400 years in the past. So that is centuries, that's 13 or 14 centuries. It's many, many lifetimes. Far, far longer than Americans have been in the U.S., right? I just watched a very detailed documentary of the Pilgrims landing, and that's 1620. So from then to now, it's 420 years. Okay, so the Arabs were there that plus another 1,000 years, more than triple the time. So yeah, that's a long time.
They weren't there at all, and they didn't have a national consciousness.
They didn't have a national consciousness. Well, the whole point of Zionism is the Jews didn't have a national consciousness either. I mean, again, this is an irrelevant idea. Like, who cares if they haven't? Like, your rights aren't dependent on how you identify. If someone's aggressing against me and they're like, well, actually, the only people who have the rights here are people who have a very specific national identity, and you don't have that. Your identity is like the American identity, and that's a broader thing. And again, identity is very fluid. It changes all the time, and maybe I'll get to it later. But quite ironically, while it may be true that there was no Palestinian state, that's fine. That's historically accurate. Just like there was no Jewish state either, and there weren't necessarily people. There were locals who believed in their local things, but they didn't necessarily have a Palestinian identity. Maybe they consider themselves Ottomans or Arabs or whatever. That does not mean they have no rights or that they can't have property or that they're okay to be Nakbad or whatever. But the other interesting thing is, like, if you give them a common experience, that common experience can become the basis of an identity. And the best way to do that, actually, and I don't mean this like ethically, like it's a horrible way to do it, but the most surefire way to do that is to target and oppress a certain group, and then they will have that as a shared experience. Everyone in Gaza and the West Bank I mean, even right now, because of what's happening, West Bank is, I don't want to pretend like there isn't horrible stuff happening in the West Bank. There is, and there always has been. But, because of what's happening in Gaza specifically, Gazans are going to have a different identity than other people from West Bank. But maybe that's part of the reason they want to do it. But it doesn't matter if you have such an identity. B, the actions of Israel and Zionism have created that identity. And it's basically a co-creation with the Zionist Israeli nationality. Which again didn't exist before that. I mean, the writing of many Jews I don't consider them. They didn't consider themselves Israeli. There wasn't such a thing. They were like, I'm a German, or I'm a Russian, or I'm an American, but I'm a Jewish. That's my religious affiliation, but it's not the be all and end all of my identity necessarily.
We came back, made it our land, and we said,
made it their land.
Okay.
It was given by an empire, by the British Empire.
We now will live together. We decided to establish a state in 1948.
Not just a state, a Jewish state. A Jewish state. What does that mean? Sometimes we'll say Jewish democracy. What does that mean? It doesn't just mean, because they'll say there's Arabs, there's Christians, there's these minority groups, Berbers, or Bedouin, who live in Israel. Totally true. And there's there's a hierarchy of rights and privileges here, and not all Arabs are created equally in that, because there's Christian Arabs and there's Druze and there's um, less, like I said, I mentioned the Bedouin. The Bedouin they're Arab, they're Muslim, but they're culturally different and don't necessarily identify with the other Palestinians. But at the end of the day, it's not a democracy in the sense of whatever happens, happens, or whoever gets elected, gets elected. It must be a Jewish state, whatever that means. But any definition you come up with, it has to mean that it's somehow Jewish supremacist. It's somehow, some way, either codified in law or by convention or some combination of the two, the Jews must be in control. And that whatever political authority other people have that are not Jewish, that it is less, that their influence is less. Maybe they can be civil servants, maybe they can get benefits, maybe they can vote, maybe they can run for parliament, and they'll say, oh, there's 20% Arabs. Yeah, it's 20%. It's always, forever, 100% a minority. And if it's just let it be, it's just pure democracy, why call it a Jewish state? Why call it a Jewish democracy?
That's 75 years ago. And we said every.
By the way, there were Zionists who did not believe that. There were Zionists who thought we should be friends with them and just have it all be equal and have there be so there's strains of Zionism that are really far less objectionable, and tragically that's not this type that kind of created the state and as we know it today. It might have created something different. It's hard to know for sure.
Everybody can live here. The Arabs said there can't be a Jewish state. You have no right to.
Yeah, so notice that now he calls it a Jewish state. Yeah, but he's right here. They're not objecting necessarily to a state. If they just said there's going to be a state, and the Jewish people who live here can be part of it, and the non-Jewish people who live here can be part of it, and there may have been people who objected to that, but far fewer. But when you come and say it will be a Jewish state to the exclusion of non-Jews, and it doesn't help that if some of those groups, like Muslims, have religious prohibitions against being subservient to non-Muslim rulers and especially Jewish ones. It certainly didn't help. It's a little bit different. It's one thing, again, to compare it to the Free State Project. It's one thing to say, hey, I want to come here, I want to vote, I want to take part in society, I want to go through the process to change things. Versus if I come and say, this is going to be my state for my people. It's just going to be for libertarians and that's it. Anyone who's not a libertarian, you can be janitors and you can, be untermensch and maybe we'll give you some benefits, but it's going to be our state and our state only, because libertarians need a place in the world because we're people without a land and a land without a, whatever. I would imagine there'd be a lot more backlash to that proposal than what's actually happening.
To be here. It's our land. It's not your land. It's been our land for 3,500 years.
Okay, so he's what, invoking the Bible now to say he's got a, it's our land because the Bible says it's our land. And the 1,400 years, even by his own estimate, which I think is kind of silly, totally hand-waved away.
Years. If you took over your somebody's apartment, knocked them out.
Oh, we're going to justify a ethnic cleansing with an analogy of an apartment. Also, it's funny he uses, there's all these videos of Jews taking people's apartments.
Dispossessed them, and they never gave up the claim. They said,
actually, I'm just noticing listen to this. This is like projection.
Said there can't be a Jewish state. You have no right to be here.
Listen to this.
It's our land. It's not your land. It's been our land for 3,500 years. If you took over your somebody's apartment, knocked them out, dispossessed them, and they never gave up the claim.
I mean, like all those Palestinians with the keys still and the deeds. You find videos right now of American Jewish guys from Brooklyn going in and just taking apartments with their nasally accents from, and they're off the boat, never been there before, kicking out an Arab. Can you imagine that?
They said our claim, and you left this barren dump, okay? And
why'd you want it so bad if it's such a barren dump?
The families, the progeny of the people you kicked out, came back, rebuilt the house.
began his own story 1,400 years later, and we don't know that, by the way. This is the other problem. Can you draw the actual connection? It's nice enough to say, and it may even be true, but who really knows? How do you know that your families, and also, does this, like, let's say it is true that, Benjamin Netanyahu had a paternal, it's through the maternal, so it's to be Jewish, it has to be for the mother's line. But let's say, you go back in his lineage, his maternal grandmothers, and you go back, I don't, let's say it's 25 generations or 30, whatever it is. And sure enough, his ancestor was lived in Israel and or in Judea, as it would have been called, and she got expelled by somebody. Maybe it was the Romans, maybe it was the Arabs. Who knows? Doesn't have to know exactly. And let's say, she got expelled, and in his case, apparently, eventually, sooner or later, ended up in Poland, and was in Poland for hundreds or thousands of years. And in the time she's, mating and having generation after generation. And now, if you look at him now, he's European. He's white. He's got blue eyes. He doesn't actually have blue eyes, but many of them do. And you could say, yeah, he's 99% Polish now, but because of that one grandmother, 25 times over. Or, me, I can just convert and I can invoke the same thing. Or can I not? I mean, he's going to say that, like, and maybe the arguments that they discriminate against Ethiopian Jews and whatever, but like,
You cannot come back and tell them, you don't belong here, we're going to kick you out, especially
after 1,400 years, you kind of can, yeah, yeah. Like your property rights aren't indefinite for all time, for infinity. If Elon Musk gets his way and we colonize Mars, and in 100,000 years somebody shows up and a Native American shows up and it's like, I'm a Native American from Mars and our family's been there 100,000 years, and originally we were Abenaki, and so I'm taking, this is like a joke.
since you're latecomers who've come to live in part of the house, which is what
I mean, the whole story is Moses is a latecomer and genocides the Canaanites.
the so-called Palestinians are. Okay, we say to them,
It's only latecomer. I mean, well, if he's going to say 3,200 years, that sounds like a long time ago, but there's a scale and it's relative. Compared to what? Compared to the first humans leaving Africa 70,000 years ago, maybe. And again, this is getting revised through history. Like, but we could just say, well, the expulsion by the Arabs that he's alleging here, you could just say that's ancient. That's 1,400 years ago. That's a really long time ago. That might as well be forever. Who cares? The stuff before that, it's kind of, so there's this, people say truncating the antecedents. It's like you zoom in to just this one point and then ignore all other context. And you can just you can cherry pick what segments of history matter and everything else doesn't. It's just, and again, as history, this would be terrible, but to start to invoke this to justify an annexation, a war, a genocide, if you want to call it that, a mass murder, whatever, is quite frankly horrific.
you can live here, we can live here, but it's our land, it's our state. And the reason this conflict...
So yes, you can live here, but you have to be subjugated. You have to be dominated by the Jews. Maybe we'll be nice about the domination. Based on how some of the settlers act, it does seem like some Jews would not be nice, that they take the domination to the point of we can rape you and we can kill you and you're our slaves and we can do whatever we want. Not all Jews think that, but a lot of Jews do, and they say so, and it's in their Talmud, in their book. But yeah, it could be like, well, yeah, you can live here, but you can't have equal rights. You always have to be subordinate to the Jewish state, always, forever, no matter what you do, no matter how. And this is very Talmudic. It doesn't matter how good you are, how wonderful you are, how loyal. You could be the most loyal person, the most hardworking person, the most pro-Israel, patriotic, whatever. If you're not Jewish, it's not for you. It's a Jewish state. You can only be the number one, second best, at best. Or you can be a slave, or worse than a snake that deserves to be killed. And we'll just kill your family or kill your animals or cut down your trees. Or have some other guy who converted to Judaism yesterday come and say he has a better claim to your family's ancestral home, which, yeah, 1,400 years is more than enough to call it ancestral. And this is not even assuming that they aren't actually the descendants of the Hebrews, which in almost all likelihood they are.
Continues is because the Palestinians, who represent the colonial powers, the Arab conquerors.
So the Palestinians are the colonists now, not Moses, and not these Rubinstein, these Ashkenazi Europeans with their European weapons and their European ideas and their European society and their European languages. At the start, anyway, they're not the colonizers, or they're or the British who gave it to them, the greatest colonizers who ever lived.
Of the Middle East and beyond, they're saying you have no right for a Jewish state. Well, we do. If any people has any right to a state, if any people never get...
I mean, I'm an anarchist, so I don't, rights to states or whatever, but like, it wouldn't be so objectionable if you said there's going to be a state in Israel and it will be majority Jewish, I mean, or in de facto that'll be the case. It'd be harder to object to, but because they say it's a Jewish state, it has to be Jewish, a Jewish democracy, then that means everyone else who's not Jewish is just automatically less, and plenty of people object to that. I'm sorry.
Gave up
that shouldn't be surprising to anyone.
Their dreams of returning to their ancestral home. If any people rebuilt their home from nothing...
Like, I don't like the U.S. government, and I've said so many times, and I have so many reasons for that. But at the end of the day, most people don't care. No, but if the U.S. government said this government is for, I don't know, if they just it's just for Scientologists, or it's just for Mormons, or it's just for one group, and everybody else, you can live here, but it's not for you. The state does not belong to you, never will. Even the most normie, unsophisticated, apathetic people would object to that.
Nothing from barren, wasted land. It's the Jewish people. To tell them, you have suffered more than anyone else.
I mean, the Jews as a group, if you go back, yes, you can say that they've suffered a lot. Everyone has suffered a lot. I'd say, blacks in Africa who were enslaved suffered an awful lot. Just the 400 years thing, if this is the narrative we're going to go through, that's 400 years of literal, unrelenting slavery. And even more if we're talking about other areas. And that's just one example. Also, just totally irrelevant. Like if you're black now, you don't have scars on your back from a lash. You don't have scabs on your fingers from picking cotton. You were never a slave. That horrible thing in history, it is history. That's that stain. You can learn about it and read about it and think about it and empathize and whatever. But its legal and physical and psychological effect on you should be remote. And with the Jews, of course, we have a more recent thing. We have the Holocaust, which not many survivors are still around, but there's still some. He wasn't there. I mean, he didn't survive the Holocaust. But to say more than anyone else, it's quite chauvinistic.
You have never lost your dream of coming back.
You don't. I've never lost my dream for the Taj Mahal. That's not an ethical argument that I can then reappropriate it.
And rebuilding your national life.
And I could just, by the way, just say that I'm an Indo-European. The Aryans founded India. They're the originators of Indian civilization, and the fucking Hindus have fucked it up, and they don't know what they're doing, and so it's a dump, which is true, and so I've always had a dream that the Taj Mahal should belong to me, and so it should.
Life in your ancestral homeland, you have no right to be.
I thought it was Ur or Egypt, but yeah, let's just pick Canaan for now.
There. But the Arabs who are trying to destroy you, they have that right. That is a complete perversion of history and also a complete perversion of justice. The Jews belong to this land. This land belongs to the Jews. The
God said so.
Palestinians are free to live here next to us.
As second-class citizens at the whim of the most overt bigotry that the state will tolerate, which has seen to be quite a bit. Rapes, murders, yeah.
Among us, but they're not free.
They will occasionally make a show of punishing a Jewish zealot for doing something bad to an Arab. That does happen sometimes. Uh, there's a total asymmetry that they won't be punished nearly as much or nearly as regularly. They let most of it go away, and it's just for PR, and everybody knows it.
To demand the dissolution of the Jewish state. That is not justice. That is
Israel as a state's not going to go anywhere. The people who live there are not going to go anywhere. I think it would be horrible to try and make them leave, but the state should change, and the state should either divide into two states, or it should give the Palestinians their rights. And now, because of what they've done, that may not be possible right now. So I think it's probably going to have to give them two states, or it can just genocide them. I mean, that's the other and I think what we're seeing is, by and large, I mean, again, Israeli society is not a monolith, but it does seem like if they have to choose between having two states, where one of them is run by people who they know hate them forever, and they will, not forever, for the hatred is going to be very, very strong for a very long time for completely understandable reasons. And any state that occupies that place is going to hate Israelis. They might pragmatically not go to war with them because, Israel's a powerful state with nukes. But they also probably think that they can't have them in their state. You can't give them equal rights. This is from their point of view, because too many of them hate their guts. And that's very plausible. So they're probably, it looks like what they're going to do is try and ethnically cleanse. They're going to kill as many as they can. They're going to try and force them to leave. And I think they might be pushing their luck to the point where, like, they're very few, it wouldn't be easy to threaten the state of Israel, but what they're doing is kind of setting themselves up for some kind of national suicide with their neighbors or with themselves, because they can't get over. I mean, so there's the religious bigotry of just thinking Jews are better than everyone else. Not all Jews think that, obviously, but it's all over the Talmud, and many of them talk about it that way, and they think about it like that. And then there's a big group that don't literally believe that, but are inclined to believe that, or that they have all these rose-colored glasses where they fairy tale-ize Israel, and they don't, in their heart of hearts, they don't think everyone who's not a Jew is less than people who are Jewish, but they just love Israel so much. But it's you have to understand, everyone else is going to hate you, and you can't get away with it forever.
justice. That's the shortest lecture I can give you about Jewish history.
Yeah, he got a lot of wrong stuff in a very short amount of time, so I'll give him credit for that. Let's see.
Colonial occupation, let's say, by the Jews. Why do you think that idea has gained such cachet, not least in the West?
Because of ignorance? I mean, what do you mean they were here first? Well, you're familiar with this.
I mean, the Bible says that Moses, genocide of the Canaanites, that they're attacking these established cities. They're calling them cities. The walls of Jericho, which we know Jericho is an ancient, some people think it's the oldest city in the world. It's 8, 9, 10,000 years old. I guess they were all Jews the whole time, So, yeah, that's your own mythical story there says that.
Story of Jesus, right? Jesus was a Jewish rabbi living in.
What does the Talmud say about Jesus and Christians? This is what, and we're on the Daily Wire. Like, does Jordan Peterson not know this?
2,000 years.
Again, and I'm not a believing Christian. I'm agnostic. It's just kind of really awkward for me to see, like,
years ago. He was a rabbi from the Galilee, okay? He came to Jerusalem. He turned the money tables of the tables of the money changers on the Temple Mount. Where did that happen? Did it happen in Tibet? It happened here. Jerusalem was our capital.
Okay, so Jesus, Christian. So then do Christians now also have an equal claim to the land? That happened there. This rabbi from Galilee, who I would agree is probably a real person, he's a Hebrew. He's Benjamin Hussein himself, and then he started a religion. That religion is spread all over the world, called Christianity. And its roots go exactly back, right? Because there's no claim that Jesus was a convert or he was an immigrant or anything like that. He's a Hebrew. He has exactly 100% exactly the same claim as every other Jewish person. And then he starts a religion that spreads, and it's 100, 1,000 times more popular than Judaism. And therefore, if you're a Christian, should you not also have an equal claim to this land?
They made it our capital 3,000 years ago. So the Jews are here to try to say that they weren't here and that the Palestinians were here thousands of years ago is ridiculous. Anybody who can.
Yeah, they would have been called Palestinians probably, although the name does go back thousands of years. But again, you don't have to have a certain national identity or ethnic identity or religious identity to have rights or to have property rights or to live in a certain place. And again, there was no Israeli identity either.
Google this and find out how absurd this thing is. So as far as reinventing ancient history, that is unpardonable, because anybody can find out and understand that the Jews were here for thousands of years, the Palestinians weren't here. As far as modern times are concerned, what the Palestinians have said is, and I write this in my book, and I show it because it's so comical. What they say is, we were here, Palestine was a verdant land in the 19th century, teeming with the Palestinians, until the Jews came in, took it over and threw it out. Okay, well, that's what Arafat effectively said in his infamous speech in the United Nations, blaming
Arafat's not the only one who had infamous speeches at the United Nations. It's very likely that his speech in the United Nations saying we're not going to make a deal with the Palestinians, that we have a new way where we can just make deals with the Arab states using the Abraham Accords as a template, is what directly perpetrated or made the October 7th attacks very likely / potentially necessary. Like, if you tell someone that you can't win, you can't negotiate, we're going to take whatever we want, and we're totally going to bypass you. Well, if you can't negotiate, then you have to fight.
Zionism, equating Zionism with racism. Well, there's only one problem with that. He said that the Jewish invasion of this verdant Palestinian homeland happened in 1881, okay? The problem with that is that 12 years before, a famous visitor, among hundreds of visitors, named Mark Twain, visited the Holy Land.
He's going to tell the Mark Twain time immemorial lie. There's a good book on this called Chutzpah by Norman Finkelstein.
And he describes a totally different picture. He describes Palestine, I'm quoting him, is a vast wasteland. He said, only imagination can grace this barren land with the...
Much of the United States is a vast wasteland. Even today, parts of Israel are vast wastelands.
The pomp of circumstance in life. It's just, he said, we traveled for a whole day. We didn't see, in the Galilee, we didn't see a human being, one single human being. He said, Jerusalem...
I bet there's parts of Gaza you could travel for a while today and not see a single human being either.
Sits in sackcloth and ashes.
At least not one who's alive.
And as he was saying that, it's the Jewish return that began building the land. Well, perhaps one could argue, it's obvious that Mark Twain was not in the service of the Jewish state because it didn't exist.
Okay, so the Jewish state didn't exist. There's no Israeli nationality. Ergo, these people have no rights. Ergo, these people from Europe and the United States and Russia who are moving there, they don't have an Israeli passport. They don't have an Israeli identity. They're just people from, they're part of a religious sect, one of many who have ties to the Holy Land. The Muslims certainly do. The Christians certainly do. So they have no rights. They can't move. They can't live there.
He wasn't in the service of the Jewish lobby because there wasn't any Jewish lobby.
But of course, the implication being that there is one now, which of course there is.
Just reporting what was there. Could there possibly have been a tremendous influx of Palestinians between 1869 and 1881, the year that...
Yeah, this is where he's making another one of these strangely specific parallels with South Africa. again, the country that it gets compared, we always hear apartheid, because one of the things, I think this is actually, I know it's true in South Africa. I don't know if it's so true with Israel, is that yes, there were native blacks there, of course. There were whites there as well. When the economy in South Africa started to really take off, especially after World War II, you did get a lot of in-migration from other parts of Africa. A lot of other black Africans moved in there. Now, there were millions of native black people who were from there originally, but a lot of Nigerians came. So it wasn't just the Xhosa and the Hasda and whoever, the native, the Zulu, the Bechuanaland land people, but like a lot of black Africans did immigrate to South Africa, and there's no dispute about that. But that does not mean that there were no black Africans there before. It also doesn't justify apartheid as it existed, and it certainly doesn't justify it in Israel now.
But Arafat says the Jewish invasion began and
also, to just aside, Coleman Hughes is very smart, but his claim that Israel is not an apartheid state because there are Arabs there is totally stupid. Apartheid does not mean that there are no people there that are in the excluded group. Apartheid in South Africa did not mean that there were no blacks. There were lots of blacks. There were millions. They were a majority of the population, a large majority of the population. They just didn't have equal rights. There was a two-tiered or three-tiered legal system. And of course, there were exclusionary zones, but there are exclusionary zones in Israel. So again, very, very ominous parallels. The two states probably cooperated in their nuclear weapons programs also, which is something that isn't talked about that much anymore, but is very likely the case.
Destroy the Palestinian paradise. Well, alas, no, because in the year 1881, another famous visitor visits Israel, and he writes,
I'm just going to go to the Negev desert and walk around and be like, it's empty. It's a wasteland.
Visits this land. And he writes also his memoirs, okay? His name was Arthur Penrhyn Stanley. He was a very famous courtier of Queen Victoria's court.
He's got one quote that we're going to make really, really, really famous. Yeah, so Alan Dershowitz, one of Israel's biggest apologists, wrote a book, and in the book he plagiarized another book called From Time Immemorial. And From Time Immemorial is a book basically grafting onto this Mark Twain quote and alleging basically that Palestine was empty. There were it's implied that there's nobody there. Obviously, there were people there, but it's just to minimize the degree of population there, the degree of civilization there. And to be fair, it wasn't like there were skyscrapers or big telecom companies. Of course, those didn't exist anywhere in that time period. But Dershowitz plagiarized this book, and Norman Finkelstein wrote articles basically calling him out for his plagiarism. It was so blatant that he was even recopying like typos from the original, and then not attesting, not attributing them. So, and then Norman Finkelstein ended up losing his job over this, even though the plagiarism was basically admitted. But Dershowitz was powerful enough to have it be done.
Okay, and he came here on a special visit, and he says, "I look south and I look north." He says, "I'm in Judea, and I see nothing." He says, "A barren expanse." And they both express, both Twain and Arthur Penrhyn Stanley say the same thing. When will the Jews come back and bring this land to life? And the answer is right then. We came back, brought it back to life. There were Arabs living here, but it was, as I say, a barren wasteland. But
So there were Arabs living there, but it was a barren wasteland. Because earlier he said that the Arabs were so unique about them is that they brought in colonists and they took the land. Like what, did they just sit on the land and not farm, not build any
began to immigrate naturally because we created a rise in the standard of living that attracted Arabs.
This could be partially true. I don't know the full details on this. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a lot of investment going on, not just because of Zionism, also because of British imperialism. Like the British, one of the things about imperialism is you end up investing and losing a lot of money. It's why imperialism is not a good idea generally. And also Zionist investment, but that does not invalidate the rights of either those immigrants or the people who were there first.
from neighboring states. Those Arabs are now the descendants.
And I can't tell if Jordan Peterson is just an idiot or totally ignorant, or if he is doing his best to pretend to be that way.
So those Arabs who migrated as a result of the Jewish return, many of them now are considered Palestinians. So what I'm saying,
well, that's where they live. They have rights. Doesn't matter. I don't care if you just, let's just say it's just an established fact that they are just Arabs. They're just Arabs, whatever that means. This is about as relevant as when the Russians say Ukrainian's not a language. It's not its own language. It's just a dialect of Russian. That's stupid, but let's just concede the point that yes, it is. It's just Russian. It's just their indistinguishable language. That doesn't make the war okay in any way. Whether or not there is a national identity called Palestinian is irrelevant to whether you can evict, murder, steal, rob, dispossess, the people living there.
and I'm saying this to you, Jordan, and to your audience, there has been a complete fabrication of history. It's the biggest lie.
I totally agree. Wow, he's right in a Freudian sense. Okay, let's see, 27. We're not going to do the whole video. It's way too long.
People have a valid claim to the present territory.
Well, and
There were a lot of movement back and forth,
Yes,
but the Jews have actually taken the land and made something of it.
well, I'm saying something else, though. I'm saying that they held the land for 2,000 years, were kicked out. The Arabs came and conquered it and immediately lost it to others and did nothing with it.
So you held it and then you lost it, but you didn't lose it. And again, I'm not a Jew, but I can convert to Judaism, and then it becomes my land also.
Others did nothing with it. So it was basically, they took over my apartment, okay, a long time ago. The guys
Genocide by analogy.
who took over, who basically kicked me out, were kicked out themselves. The apartment was left barren, and many decades, in this case centuries later, I come back to this barren
So are you hundreds of years old, many centuries later?
mess, okay, this ruin, and I build it up back, and I not only improve it, I not only make my ownership based on improvement, but that nobody else did anything with it.
So why do we have all these videos of, why are you bulldozing things? What are you bulldozing? Why are you giving apartments to guys from Brooklyn? What are they getting that apartment from? Who built the apartment? Who owns it?
There was no someone else. There practically were no tenants.
Right.
That's my argument.
Dome of the Rock just was empty. Jerusalem, not a city. Stop being a city.
Right. You're also making the case that when the Jews came to Israel, they were doing what they could to coexist with the people who
Some of them were, for sure. Some of them were also for sure not doing that.
were there,
Right.
with a sparse number of people who were there, but also to set up a state that would invite other people who weren't Jewish to live there as well.
No, it doesn't invite people who are not Jewish to live there. It will tolerate people as a permanent underclass who are not Jewish.
So it wasn't an oppressive regime in any
Again, why do they call it a Jewish state? Why do they call it a Jewish democracy, if not for that reason? What's the thing that makes it Jewish or makes it...
No,
sense
well,
of,
we
in any
know what
classic
happened.
sense of the word.
We know what happened. We know that when 75 years ago, when the state of Israel was declared, you didn't have a single Arab refugee. I mean, the Arabs say now that their enmity to Israel and the reason they went to war with Israel was because of the Arab refugee. But there wasn't a single Arab refugee or Palestinian refugee when Israel was established. In fact, the refugees are the result of Arab aggression and not its cause. And in fact, the Arab onslaught, 5 Arab armies that attacked the tiny Jewish state in its inception, these 5 Arab armies created 2 refugee problems. One, the Palestinian refugees who fled before the advancing.
And why did they attack? Because they're just evil and they hate Jews. You're doing a land grab. The United Nations just declared that this is happening and tough luck. And then they said, well, we'll see about it. And of course, they were in no position to do that. As small as the Jewish army was at this point, it was just much better organized, equipped, trained, experienced, motivated than the vast majority of the Arab military forces are some of the Jordanian forces were pretty well trained by the British, but other than that, it's literally guys on camels.
armies, being promised that they could come back in a few days because the Jews would be annihilated, driven to the sea. That didn't work out, thank God. But
this is the whole Nakba didn't happen thing. Yeah, this could go on. I don't make this video too long. One thing I'd say that's interesting, though, if you look at the comments, almost all of them are negative. Almost everyone is just shocked at Jordan Peterson here. Like, he either is and there's parts of this interview where he basically says, well, it looks like you've proven that you're right and that everything you say is true, and that there's also this implication a couple times that, like, all these stupid, emotional college students are, like, for Palestine, and that's true. A lot of college students are idiots, and it's frustrating to see them wrap the Palestinian issue or the Israeli issue or the Gaza issue with, like, well, we have to abolish capitalism and get rid of the patriarchy and the colonial peoples around that. Like, just stick to the thing. So, like, the critiques you could make about the people protesting are valid critiques of those people, but those aren't valid critiques of their point. They could still be right. And there's a lot of people who are not crazy, stupid, emotional left-wing zealots from the local community college that have very trenchant arguments against the state of Israel. Where's the part where Jordan Peterson risks offending BB? Never happens. Uh, yeah, so Europeans have a right to live in their own ethno-state? Oh, no, that would be terrible. You can't have that. Yeah, it goes on. And it is interesting too, because there's this seems like belief that look, it's totally, colonialism is totally cool, conquest is totally cool as long as you, like, invest in the land and build stuff. I mean, they just go on, and, like, it's so blatant. You have Israelis now, even Netanyahu himself, like, making art and images of the complexes they're going to build in Gaza. Oh, it'll be beautiful. We'll build, resorts, and it'll be like our Abu Dhabi on the Mediterranean or whatever. It's just kind of super blatant and disgusting and horrible. Uh, I mean, I'm not thinking I'm going to do anything about it, but I just couldn't sit here and listen like that. Jordan Peterson is somebody who had earned a lot of respect from a lot of people, and I think he's just kind of squandered all of it. And I'm just like, is he an idiot, or is he a dupe, or is he? I mean, he should have enough money. He shouldn't worry about whether he has a job or not at the Daily Wire. Um, yeah. Not only was Jordan Peterson not criticizing him, he was helping him with his points, which is to show the hypocrisy of Jordan Peterson. Yeah. Jordan, it's a pity you'd let this guy take complete control of the interview, didn't ask questions that really mattered or are not comfortable. Yeah. Can't wait for the bit where Peterson angrily tells him to stop having group identity. Like he did with the European men. Yeah, isn't that interesting? There's a lot of desert lands in Egypt because the Israelis start building towns and say the land is theirs because it was empty. Yeah, exactly. You go on and on. So anyway, we could talk about this forever. Maybe I'll do a live stream soon. We can air more of this stuff because there's really a lot to go. And it's interesting how the right is splitting, how the left is splitting on this. And I think Israel is in I mean, I was talking to somebody who's very not political, and the whole thing with the pager attack that just happened. He's like, so I mean, some people's reaction was, oh, that's so awesome, that's so cool, but, like, it's just, like, literally terrorism. It's like, okay, so they're just, I mean, you could have said that they've been doing terrorism all along. They started as terrorism. They got their start as a terrorist organization.